We thank Dr. Kimberly Richburg for joining us this morning. Dr. Richburg is an associate professor of political science at Lander University. She's also in the Department of Government, Criminology, and Sociology. So that sounds like a lot of responsibilities for one professor.
Well, I don't teach all those things. So.
Okay. Dr. Richburg has Southern roots. She received her bachelor's degree in Clemson and her PhD in North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me this morning. I appreciate it.
I came across your name as part of the Lander University Electoral Initiative program that launched about a month ago. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is it still ongoing or has it wrapped up?
Yeah, actually, that program was funded by South Carolina Humanities Grant. And we had 4 events this semester at Lander. And unfortunately, we have done our 4th and last event. However, the program actually, that series started in the fall. But, and Lander was not the only school to host sessions. There were several other schools. I know USC did, and I think Clemson did, and a few other schools hosted events. And if you go to the website of the electoral initiatives page of the South Carolina Humanities Grant, you can actually see a brief description of all of the events that were a part of that series. But
we've been
Lander got on board in the spring.
Yeah. We've been sharing those links all throughout these past couple of months.
Oh, excellent.
So
excellent.
I understand there's some more sessions going on, even if they're not based out of Lander. And these are free to the community, right?
They are free and open to the community. A great opportunity,
That's
because
my favorite kind of education, the free one.
Sometimes people pay a lot of money to listen to some of these sessions, but it's free and it's open to the public. And we love that about it.
Well, as a political science professional, how tough is it for you to set aside your personal beliefs and passions when you're in the classroom or in a public forum? I mean, I watched the session you did with Dr. McMillan and Dr. Malone and others. I could never participate in something like that without blowing my stack or spiraling into a rant at some point. How do you do it?
Yeah, I've been asked that question before, actually by a number of relatives have asked me that question. Well, this is a discipline. It's a social science, or it's what you think of as political science or political studies. So this is something that's being studied. And when we're studying something and when we're talking about something, we want to approach this as a scientist or as a professional versus this is an opinionated column that we're writing. Now, yes, our opinions, certainly my opinions do come into play at some point. But I really want to try to help get information out there. I want to try to help teach students some analytical skills, teach them how to process some of the political related information that is out there. I want to teach them to be critics. And in class, oftentimes, I'll say things that may not be my viewpoint, but I want to push students into thinking outside of their boxes, essentially. And when we can do that, sometimes we can get a better understanding for why some people think in the way that they do. Our views may or may not change, but it's nice to have a perspective on the differences in opinions and just some of the things, just to understand the background behind some of those opinions.
Your students may not be as disciplined, so they must bring their opinions into the classroom. Well, and some of them have got to be some strong and kind of, I would say, upsetting opinions. How do you handle that? Yeah,
and that's the thing. And for one, I try to be, nobody's perfect, but I try to be the professional in the room. They're students, I'm the professional. But one way to really help with that is to try and structure discussions in a way such that you're not just asking people about their opinions, because when people give opinions, those opinions may not be based on very much. They may be pretty thin and pretty weak. But, I try to structure things such that they can answer questions that have to do with what we're talking about. And sometimes those questions may take trying to understand and even sometimes even defend an opinion that's not there. So I think the way it's structured can really, really help out with some of that. But no method is perfect. And sometimes people do have strong opinions. Sometimes they get aired. But I think setting some structure at the beginning of the course and setting some kind of ground rules about being respectful to others and letting people, sometimes somebody might really disagree strongly with a student and cut in. And I was like, well, hold on. Let's let them finish their statements first. But those are some techniques that I use, but possible. But every now and again, I will assert an opinion. One of the few things, a few opinions that I do assert in class is I encourage my students, please get registered to vote, get out and vote. And I tell them, I said, listen, this is one of the few things you're going to hear from me telling you that I think you should do. But I want y'all to be civically involved.
Now that ties right into my next question, talking about motivating the students and the youth. Now you've taught countless youth in your classrooms over the years. What have you seen as effective motivators to get them interested in acting and doing politics beyond just reading and writing about it?
Right. Oh, and that could be a challenge to get them to read and write about it and learn about it, first of all. Because one of the most common things I've gotten over the years from non-political science majors, and the vast majority of the students that I teach are non-political science majors, and I actually love that, is some students will give a disclaimer. I'm really enjoying what we're talking about right now, but I'm really not into politics. I'm like, okay, calm down. We're not asking you to be a politician. I'm glad you're enjoying it. It's okay to enjoy learning more, and hopefully that encourages you to learn more. It's tricky to really say what's been effective at motivating our students to get involved. One thing, I can't tell you how much of a factor this has been, but just getting students to learn a little bit more about the political system and how it works. I think that could be helpful, because sometimes when you learn more about something, you're less intimidated by it. You may learn that, wow, I do have a vested interest in getting involved and voted. Some students say, wow, I didn't realize that so many Americans didn't vote, or I didn't realize that so many young people don't vote. So learning more about what goes on in the political system, I think that can definitely be a good motivating factor. We have a political science association. I advised that for some years, and I have a colleague who's advising it now. They do a voter registration drive every year. Whether it's a presidential election year or not, they do a drive every year. And so we advertise that in the classroom, they set up, and those drives are usually what we would consider to be pretty successful at getting our students registered. So, I encourage them to do so, let them learn about the system, but also I say, hey, there's this cool student club, the PSA, they're going to be set up such and such a time, stop by. And I've worked the voter registration table a lot. And it's funny, you'll see students walk by, and some of them walk by. I'm like, hello, how are you today? Are you registered to vote? No. Do you want to register? I'm not sure. Well, we'll be here for X number of days, or here you can take a voter registration application, or we can show you the link where you can register. South Carolina does now allow voter registration. Many people can do it online. This is how to do it, whether you do it or not. So I think working through student organizations, and that's not the only organization which encourages voter registration. So those are two methods that I think have had some success. I'm not sure how much, but I think those are two things that have some promise. Yeah.
Now, to switch topics a little bit, a couple of years back, you gave a public lecture about a piece of history that many people in South Carolina may not be aware of. Now, I think most of our viewers here and people watching this know about Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. But many may not realize that something happened here in South Carolina a few years prior to that, which played a huge role in that other more famous case. Can you talk about that for a few minutes?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I would be delighted to. Well, I grew up in Summerton, South Carolina, which is a small town about halfway between Columbia and Charleston, a little bit close to Columbia. And so back in the early 1950s, a series of events had started. Some of the parents had started to complain about the gross inequities in the segregated school system at the time. The white schools were much better equipped than the quote unquote Black schools. And people had started to challenge the local school board. And what this culminated in after a couple of years was the Briggs versus Elliott lawsuit, which actually challenged the legality of segregated public school systems on the basis that the facilities reserved for the schools based on race were not equal. And so my connection to that is not only being from Somerton, but my several members of my father's family in particular, the Reverend E. Richburg, who was Reverend Eddie Richburg, who was my great uncle, who died before 1960. So my dad was still a teenager when he died, but he was one of the leaders of that. And there were a number of leaders. Reverend J.A. Delane was almost the poster child for the movement. A number of ministers were involved, and a number of community people were leaders. But Uncle Eddie, as also all my life I've heard him referred to, was a leader in that movement, trying to get that lawsuit actually going. And it is true that most people have heard of Briggs versus LA, but they have no idea that one of those cases that make up the consolidated group of cases that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on in the Brown v. Board of Education case in 1954, that one of those cases came from South Carolina, came from Clarendon County. Now, I grew up being aware of this pretty much my whole life because of my father having had relatives who were involved in it. But yeah, even a lot of people in South Carolina still don't realize that. But it's a very, very significant piece of history of which I'm very proud to have a connection to.
Well, that's really interesting because I have a great uncle and he didn't do anything. So I'm really envious that you have a deep family history that made an impact on this whole nation. You know, for decades to come. That's really neat.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Now, here we are in April, and we're already several months into the Biden administration, and a lot of drama occurred prior to Inauguration Day, going all the way back to Election Day itself. But I want to talk a little bit about what you shared with the community about the 2020 election. You seem like a strong numbers person. And I thought it was really interesting, some of the insights you had about women getting involved in politics. Mm-hmm. What are some of the highlights that you think we should know about?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. First of all, actually going even back to 2018 than 2020. In 2020, number one, we saw more women run for congressional seats than ever before. It was record-breaking. Going back a bit, in 2018, basically the 2020 record broke the 2018 record. In 2018, we saw the highest number of women running for congressional seats than we'd seen before up until that time. But not only that, we actually are at a point now where we have a higher percentage of Congress members who are women than we've ever had before. It's almost 27%. And while that is still a far cry from the over half of the U.S. population that women make up, this is an all-time high. And this continues the trend of a growing number of women in Congress. So what we see here is, in terms of gender, Congress is moving more in the direction of slowly starting to look more like the demographics of the United States. And the idea here is that as more women get into congressional seats, the idea is that we will get not just descriptive representation in the sense that there are more women, but we will get issues that women are really tend to be really more concerned about, that those issues will get some more airtime as this continues to go. We saw more minority women run for Congress than we had ever seen before. And once again, I think this is reflective of a couple of things. Just in general, the important role that women play in politics in this country. And granted, we have more than two political parties in this country, but even though women make up a higher percentage of the Democratic Party than they do in the Republican Party, women are they have too important of a presence to be ignored by either party. And minority women have come on the scene and are running for congressional seats in a way that they have not before. So once again, I think there's potential here to get more minority interests to get some airtime, and particularly more interests that minority women are interested in to really get some airtime here.
We tend to have kind of an assumption that women who are in office tend to be, on the Democratic persuasion, and that the Republicans are the good old boys club. But that's changing, isn't it?
It's changing, but that actually brings me to another point. That assumption is changing, but there's still a lot of truth to that. Right now, we saw more. Okay, in 2018, Democratic women ran in huge numbers. They picked up a lot of seats. In 2018, there were only about, I believe, 13 Republican women in the U.S. House, whereas you had almost 6 times as many of that who were Democratic women who were serving in the House. Even today, you still have about almost 3 times as many Democratic women in Congress as are Republican women, not quite. But in 2020, this was a huge year for Republican women. We saw more Republican women run than had ever run before. And Republican women now hold more seats in Congress than they've ever held before. I think they have over maybe around 30-ish seats, and Democratic women, I think, have about 87 seats. But there's still a lot of truth to that assumption, but it is changing.
One thing that the 2020 election will always be known for was the incredible turnout, smashing records there. Now, even though we had great turnout, how does that compare with other nations throughout the world?
Okay, glasses half full first. This was about two-thirds of the eligible voters in this country turn out. Of course, hadn't seen percentages like that in 120 years. So record breaking, that's awesome. That is good. That is very good for the United States. However, compared to other democracies, in particular, if you compare that turnout to the turnout in many of the other developed countries or Western democracies, that's not considered to be a very good turnout. If you compare that turnout to developed countries in general, that's a pretty good turnout. If you compare that turnout to the other Western democracies, it's mediocre. And a lot of the Western democracies, and have to keep this in mind too, that was like our record-breaking turnout. Typically, we're going to see something closer to 60% or even in the 50s going back a few years. But no, if you compare that to the turnouts in a lot of the other Western democracies, that's the middle category, but it's not really high. A lot of the other countries have turnouts that would be a not so good year for them. They can expect to see turnouts usually in the 70-some up to maybe sometimes over 80% range. So that was good for us, but I think this should be a sign that we can still do a lot better with turnout.
Compared to other states, how did South Carolina do?
That's a good question. South Carolina did pretty good compared to the other states, but let me give you a range. South Carolina's turnout was, I think, in the mid 60-some% range, somewhere between 64 and 65, 6, 7%. That's kind of in.
Just to be clear, is that turnout of registered voters or turnout of anybody who's eligible to vote?
No, that's the turnout of eligible voters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, the turnout of registered voters, that percentage is going to always be higher because you're looking at a smaller pool.
Right.
So South Carolina was, I think, in that middle category. And we might have been a little bit in the low side of the middle category. But there's such a wide range in turnout across the states. And this is something I think a lot of Americans don't realize. In this past election, the turnout was as low as around 55% in Oklahoma and as high as, I think, 80%, I believe, in Minnesota. That's not unusual. In any given election, you can expect to see anywhere between about a 20% or less or a 25% range in turnout across the states.
Now, one final question. Just recently, Georgia has signed into law some pretty restrictive measures that, quote unquote, add confidence to the election process. And that's just the first shot across the bow.
That's the first. Yeah.
How do you envision this ending up before the 2022 elections? If you were to look into a crystal ball and try to wield all of your experience, where do you see this heading?
Yeah. And Georgia's recent change, this is the first shot that's going to come from a number of states trying to increase the restrictions to access to the vote. This definitely has the potential, this great turnout that we had, this has the potential to lessen turnout in the future. particularly among certain groups of voters, particularly among a lot of minority voters, as research has demonstrated in the past. So I think, what we could potentially see is lower turnouts, but, there are going to be efforts to try to offset some of these new restrictions in voting. And assuming that they will apply, and assuming that they won't be, inactivated or put on hold by court rulings, I think the question then is, how effective are various groups, organizations, communities, and leaders are going to be at trying to offset this potential decrease in turnout? How successful are they going to be at getting more voters registered, at mobilizing more voters to come out? So yes, if this trend continues, and if we're at this point for the midterm elections, for midterms, you're always going to see a lower turnout than in presidential elections, but this could have a suppressive impact in terms of turnout, or there's a possibility that the efforts to overcome these restrictions could help. I'm not sure.
That's a terrible prediction, I have to say. You gave both answers, which just says how tough it is. I mean, this is unprecedented times.
It is. And another thing, and I don't know, well, this is going to be tough to get through Congress, but if there is they're working on it, but if there is some significant voting rights legislation, then that somehow gets through Congress, that could actually cut down on the effectiveness of some of these new, more restrictive voting laws, or it could invalidate some of them or partially invalidate some of them. But that's going to be a tough gig. I mean, that's going to be tough.
Well, Dr. Richburg, I thank you so much for the time you gave us today. It was absolutely enlightening. Learned a ton, and I hope maybe we can call you back again sometime as circumstances change in our country. Would love to get your take on it.
Well, I would welcome it. I've had fun in this conversation today, and I hope that everyone enjoys the Greenwood Democratic Party's breakfast meeting this morning.
Thank you so much.